In this segment, we will discuss remodeling of bone tissue. So this term remodeling implies that the skeleton is removing old bone tissue and depositing new bone tissue in its place. So what we're really discussing here is maintenance of bony tissues and maintenance of the skeleton as a whole. Remodeling occurs at a fairly impressive rate. The average person remodels about 6% of the mass of their skeleton each week. So this means that over the course of an entire year, the skeleton as a whole is completely remodeled about 2 times per year, which is pretty impressive when you think about it. Remodeling itself is actually part of a larger process that's known as osteogenesis. So remodeling occurs in essentially 2 life stages. In the adolescent stage, when growth of the skeleton is occurring, that is, we're making new bony tissue, and during the adult life stage, when we're not growing so much as we're maintaining bony tissue. Osteogenesis also includes development of bony tissue, that is, initial development of bony tissue from hyaline cartilage pieces or from fibrous connective tissue pieces, and we'll take a look at that in a different segment, but that occurs during fetal development. And osteogenesis also includes the growth of bone during adolescence, that is, the lengthening and the widening of bones during growth. So we've already seen the 2 cells or the 2 cell types that control remodeling. In a previous segment, we had discussed the osteoblasts, which are cells that are forming bone tissue by laying down the extracellular matrix, the organic components of the extracellular matrix of bone tissue. So they're making collagen and glycoproteins. And we've also seen the osteoclasts, which are the cell that secrete a number of enzymes and secrete acids in order to break down the collagen fibers and glycoproteins, which is the responsibility of the enzymes, is to break down the collagen and the glycoproteins. And the acids that osteoclasts secrete are going to be dissolving the calcium minerals that form the inorganic components of bone tissue. The calcium that is liberated from the skeleton by the osteoclasts is moved into the bloodstream. And so the osteoclasts use a mechanism that we explored in Chapter 3 called receptor-mediated endocytosis. So remember that this was a form of active transport that requires ATP. But basically the osteoclast uses these receptor molecules, these receptor proteins that are on its plasma membrane to gather, in particular, the molecule to be transported, in this case, is calcium. So it uses these receptors to concentrate calcium in a vesicle, and then it moves the calcium through a vesicle, essentially through the intracellular space, and it dumps the calcium into the bloodstream. Where does remodeling occur? So remodeling occurs at the very surface of bone tissue. That is, it occurs at the internal surface or the external surface of bone, never really from the middle of bone tissue or deep within bone tissue. So recall that both the endosteum and the deep layer of the periosteum contain osteogenic cells, which osteogenic cells are the stem cells of bone that will later go on to make osteoblasts. And osteoclasts also reside here as well. Okay, so essentially new bone is added to the surface of existing bony tissue, and the osteoblasts, which are going to be building the extracellular matrix of bone tissue, form from osteogenic cells. Osteoclasts don't come from osteogenic cells, they come from another cell line and another cell type in the body, but they're found at the internal and external surfaces of bones as well. So under what circumstances do bones begin to remodel? That is, when do we start to see the skeleton breaking down old bony tissue and adding and building new bony tissue on top of that? We see that bones remodel when mechanical stresses are placed on them. That is, when our muscles exert or when our body weight exert pulling forces on muscles, the skeleton will sometimes add or remove mass from certain locations so that it can better withstand those mechanical forces. But bones also remodel when blood calcium homeostasis needs to be maintained. So recall that the skeleton essentially behaves as a bank, and the body can deposit or withdraw calcium from it as it's needed. And where that calcium goes, as I had just discussed with the osteoclasts, is that blood calcium that calcium will be moved into the bloodstream. So it helps to maintain blood calcium homeostasis. Blood calcium is very similar to body temperature in that the body likes to maintain a very specific level or a very specific concentration of blood calcium, just like our body likes to maintain a very specific level of body temperature. So we'll take a look at bone remodeling under mechanical stresses. So recall that in Chapter 1 we saw this principle called the principle of complementarity, which states that function follows form. there's a law or a rule with bone remodeling that's known as Wolff's law, and this law states that bone shape reflects the functional demands that are placed on that bone. So basically what this is saying is that bones will add or remove material from them, or the skeleton will add or remove material from the bones in order to better withstand the functional stresses and the functional demands that are placed on them. Okay. So as an example, the bones of weightlifters are much thicker and denser because as muscle mass is increased, muscle force is also increased as well, so that those much stronger muscles are exerting much stronger pulling forces on our bones, and so our bones become thicker in response to that in order to better withstand those stresses. And this is kind of exemplified by, and this is just one example here of very thicker bony projections that develop on bones as muscles pull on them. So this is the lateral view of a femur here, and you'll notice this very thick projection that's known as the greater trochanter of the femur. This projection on the femur develops when the gluteal muscles, that is the muscles of the buttocks, begin to pull on it. When we're born, this part of the femur really doesn't exist. That is, this part of the femur is relatively smooth, and it's not as this projection is not as thick. But as we're learning to walk and as we start to put body weight on this part of the femur responds by adding more bone mass and more bone tissue to this location so that it can better withstand the pulling forces, the stresses that the muscles are placing on it. So Wolff's law helps to explain a few things or a few phenomena that we see within the skeleton. So one is that we see that bedridden patients have extremely weak bones, and the reason for that is that because bedridden patients are not able to stand, they are not able to put body weight on their skeleton, and so the skeleton, in response to that lightened load, will respond by decreasing bone mass. So what happens is that our body essentially removes the unnecessary calcium and the unnecessary material from our skeleton because it doesn't need it anymore. Okay, so we see decreases in bone mass in bedridden patients and patients that are not able to move around on their own. We also see that bone mass decreases in low gravity situations, and this is for the exact same reason. It's because body weight and the force of body weight is the stimulus for maintaining bone mass. And so the body breaks down a lot of the skeleton mass because it's not needed to support it. Bone remodeling also occurs to maintain blood calcium homeostasis. And as I mentioned, the skeleton is sort of the main bank, that is the main location where we can withdraw and deposit calcium as our body needs it. Okay. As I mentioned, typical blood calcium is maintained in a very narrow range, much like our body temperature is. So typical blood calcium is maintained in a range of 9.2 to 10.4 milligrams per deciliter, and these are actually the exact same units as blood glucose levels if you are diabetic or pre-diabetic and you need to measure blood glucose levels. Bone remodeling, or blood calcium homeostasis, I should say, is maintained by three hormones, so it's maintained by the endocrine system. We see one hormone called parathyroid hormone that maintains it, another hormone called calcitriol, which is produced by the kidneys, and we see a third hormone from the thyroid gland itself that's called calcitonin. So we're going to take a look at these three hormones and how exactly they're controlling blood calcium homeostasis and what exactly they're doing when they're maintaining blood calcium homeostasis. That is, are they increasing blood calcium or are they promoting a decrease in blood calcium? So we'll take a look at those. So recall that in homeostasis we had two feedback mechanisms. We had positive and negative feedback mechanisms. The feedback control mechanism in this example, or in this case here, is negative feedback, because negative feedback always promotes the movement of a variable or the return of a variable to a very specific range. Okay. So we'll look at an instance in which blood calcium is too low, a condition that's known as hypocalcemia. And hypocalcemia is controlled by a hormone that's called parathyroid hormone that is secreted or produced by glands that are called the parathyroid glands. So within the neck is the thyroid gland. Essentially, the thyroid gland sits right under what's called the voice box or the larynx and sits just around the trachea here. So this is the thyroid gland. The parathyroid gland is actually on the posterior side, or the parathyroid glands, I should say, are actually on the posterior side of the thyroid. So if we turn the thyroid gland around, we see these little these little glands that are part of the, or at least associated with the thyroid gland, and these are the parathyroid glands. So those are the locations of the parathyroid glands. Ultimately, how does parathyroid hormone control low blood calcium or bring low blood calcium back up to its normal range? So we'll take sort of a diagrammatic approach to this. We'll kind of do a flow chart here. Okay, so we've got our body enters hypocalcemia. So our blood calcium is going to drop below that critical level of 9.2 milligrams per deciliter. That initial drop is going to trigger osteoclasts, that is, these are the cells that are going to be breaking down bone tissue to increase their activity. So when we increase the activity of osteoclasts, we're going to get more breakdown of the organic and inorganic components of bone, which means we're going to start to liberate or remove calcium from the skeleton. Okay, so calcium is essentially dissolved from the skeleton, and it's moved into the blood by the actions of the osteoclasts. And this is going to help raise our blood calcium back up to that critical level of 9.2 milligrams per deciliter. But this initial blood calcium drop also triggers the kidneys to release a hormone called calcitriol. And calcitriol has a couple of different effects on the body. One, it affects the intestines. So the intestines, when they receive this signal, when they receive this calcitriol signal, they are essentially stimulated to absorb more calcium from our diet. And that is, they're going to absorb more calcium that we've ingested. And so that's also going to help raise our blood calcium back up to that critical level of 9.2 milligrams. Calcitriol released by the kidneys is going to stimulate the kidneys to conserve calcium, that is, to prevent calcium loss in the urine, so that way we're not just urinating out calcium that our blood very desperately needs. Okay, so that's going to, in addition, that's also going to help bring calcium levels back up to that critical level. And calcitriol is going to also increase osteoclast activity. So we saw an increase in osteoclast activity from this initial stimulus of blood calcium drop, but calcitriol is also going to help increase osteoclast activity as well, which is again going to help liberate more calcium from the skeleton and put that calcium into the blood. So now we'll take a look at hypercalcemia, that is when our blood calcium rises too high, above that critical level of 10.4 milligrams per deciliter. This one's a little bit more straightforward. So this initial increase in blood calcium above that critical level is going to trigger the thyroid gland to release calcitonin. So calcitonin has an effect on both osteoclasts and osteoblasts. So if we're going to, in conditions of hypercalcemia, well, what our body needs to do is that our body needs to take calcium out of the blood and put it into the skeleton. And so it's going to do just that. So we're going to decrease the activity of osteoclasts, so that way these cells are not breaking down skeletal tissues, and it's going to increase activity of osteoblasts, which is going to promote addition of calcium into the skeleton. So essentially we're going to create a condition under which deposit of calcium into the skeleton is greater than withdrawal of the calcium from the skeleton. Okay, so calcitonin is going to increase osteoblast activity. Osteoblasts are going to lay down more organic components of bone, and that's going to cause calcium that's in the blood to move to those areas, or when it goes to those areas, it's going to crystallize and it's going to be removed from the blood and put into the skeleton. Okay, so it's deposited into the skeleton, and our blood calcium is going to drop back down below that critical level, or that critical threshold of 10.4 milligrams per deciliter. So extra calcium in the blood is going to be deposited into the skeleton in conditions of hypercalcemia.